Adrian had always imagined his return home to be filled with joy and laughter. After spending years building his business and becoming a wealthy man, he couldn't wait to surprise his father. The thought of seeing the proud smile on his father's face kept him excited throughout the journey. When he arrived at the old house, things felt different. The house looked the same from the outside, but it felt lifeless. The garden, once full of vibrant flowers, was overgrown with weeds. The cheerful sounds of family that Adrian remembered were replaced by an uneasy silence. He parked his car quietly and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. Standing at the front door, Adrian hesitated. Something didn't feel right, but he brushed the thought aside and knocked. No one answered. Puzzled, he pushed the door open and called out, "Dad? Are you home?" There was no reply. The house seemed empty, except for a faint sound coming from the backyard. Adrian paused, listening carefully. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years. Someone sobbing. His heart skipped a beat. Curiosity and concern pulled him toward the back of the house. He moved cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sobbing grew louder, mixed with the sound of water splashing. Adrian reached the backyard gate and peered through the gap. What he saw froze him in place. There, on his knees, was his father. His once strong, confident father was scrubbing the ground with a worn-out cloth. His back was hunched, and his hands shook with every movement. A bucket of soapy water sat next to him. Tears streamed down his face as he worked. Sitting on a nearby chair was a woman, his stepmother. She looked relaxed, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. Every few seconds, she would bark orders at his father. "You missed a spot. Can't you do anything right?" she snapped. Adrian couldn't believe his eyes. His father, the man who had taught him the value of hard work and dignity, was being treated like a servant. Adrian clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest. He wanted to burst in and confront the woman, but something held him back. His father's face stopped him. It wasn't just tired. It was defeated. It was the face of a man who had lost all hope. Adrian stepped back, his mind racing. Why is Dad doing this? What happened after I left? Questions swirled in his head, but he had no answers. He needed to find out the truth, and he needed to find it soon. Standing there in the shadows, Adrian made a silent promise to himself. He would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Little did he know, what he was about to uncover would change his life forever. Adrian couldn't shake the image of his father kneeling on the cold ground, scrubbing like a servant. The sight of the man who once stood tall and proud, now reduced to tears, was haunting. His heart ached, but he knew he had to remain calm. He quietly moved back from the gate and leaned against the wall of the house, taking deep breaths to steady himself. Why is this happening? He thought, his mind racing. He replayed every conversation he had with his father over the years. His father had never mentioned any struggles. In fact, he always assured Adrian that everything was fine, urging him to focus on his career. But now, Adrian couldn't help but feel that his father had been hiding something all along. Determined to get answers, Adrian quietly walked to the side of the house, trying to stay out of sight. He crouched near a window that overlooked the backyard. From this angle, he could hear every word exchanged between his father and stepmother. "Are you deaf? I told you to finish this before the guests arrive," the stepmother shouted, her tone sharp and filled with disdain. "I'm trying," his father replied softly, his voice trembling. "Trying? That's all you ever do. Try and fail. You're useless," she snapped, slamming her cup down on the table. Adrian's chest tightened with anger. His father's silence in the face of such cruelty was unbearable to witness. He wanted to storm into the yard, grab his father's hand, and take him away from this nightmare. But he knew he couldn't act on emotion alone. "No," Adrian thought, clenching his fists. "I need to understand the full picture before I do anything." His father looked up briefly, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Adrian noticed how much older and weaker he seemed. The strong man who had worked tirelessly to provide for him was now frail and broken. It was a painful sight. Adrian's stepmother stood up suddenly, her chair screeching against the concrete. She walked toward his father, towering over him. "And don't forget to clean the windows when you're done. I don't want to see a single stain," she said, her voice dripping with arrogance. "Yes, I will," his father replied, his head bowed. Adrian's hands trembled. He couldn't take it anymore. He knew he had to act soon, but he needed a plan. Charging in without understanding the situation wouldn't help his father. "What happened to you, Dad?" he thought, tears welling up in his eyes. "How did it get this bad?" Adrian quietly stepped away from the house, his mind made up. He was going to stay in town until he uncovered the truth. His father didn't deserve this, and Adrian wasn't going to let it continue any longer. As he drove away, one thing became clear: this wasn't just a visit anymore. It was a mission to save his father. No matter the cost, Adrian spent the entire night restless, replaying what he had seen at his father's house. His mind was heavy with questions. Why didn't Dad ever tell me? How could he let this happen? The man who had always been his pillar of strength now seemed so fragile, so vulnerable. Adrian had always looked up to his father as a symbol of resilience. Seeing him so defeated felt like a betrayal of everything he thought he knew. The next morning, Adrian parked his car a few streets away from the house and decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The streets were filled with memories from his childhood, biking with friends, playing catch with his dad, running errands to the small shops on the corner. Everything felt familiar, yet distant. As he passed by a familiar neighbor's house, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper noticed him. She waved from her porch. "Adrian? Is that you?" she called out, squinting to make sure it was him. Adrian smiled politely and walked over. "Yes, Mrs. Harper. It's me. It's been a long time. Oh my, you've grown so much. Your father must be so proud of you," she said warmly. But her expression changed when she looked down, her smile fading slightly. "I'm sure it must have been hard for him. After everything." Adrian's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, Mrs. Harper?" he asked carefully. Trying not to reveal what he already knew, she hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Well, I'm sure you've noticed things have been different since your stepmother came into the picture." Adrian's heart sank. He leaned in slightly. "What happened?" Mrs. Harper sighed, her face softening with pity. "Your father changed after your mother passed. He was so full of life before, but when he married that woman, everything shifted. She's not very kind to him, Adrian. She makes him do all the work around the house. I've seen him in the garden on cold mornings, shivering while she sits inside by the fire." Adrian clenched his jaw, anger bubbling inside him. But he stayed calm, letting Mrs. Harper continue. "He's too proud to ask for help, you know. He's always been that way. I tried to talk to him once, but he just brushed it off, saying he was fine." She shook her head sadly. "But he's not fine, Adrian. You can see it in his eyes." Adrian thanked Mrs. Harper and walked away, his thoughts swirling. Her words confirmed what he had suspected. His father was suffering in silence. Adrian couldn't understand why his father had allowed himself to endure such treatment. Later that day, Adrian returned to his hotel and started making plans. He decided to stay in town longer than he had intended. He would talk to the neighbors, observe his father, and gather as much information as he could. He wanted to understand how his father had ended up in this position. But one thing was certain: Adrian wouldn't leave until he had freed his father from this life of misery. Adrian spent the next few days observing his father and stepmother from a distance. He kept his presence hidden, careful not to alert them. Each day revealed more of the harsh reality his father was enduring. One afternoon, Adrian saw his father outside in the garden, planting flowers under the harsh sun. His shirt was drenched with sweat, and his back was hunched as he worked tirelessly. Meanwhile, the stepmother lounged in a chair nearby, sipping a cold drink and scrolling through her phone. Occasionally, she would bark an order, and Adrian's father would silently obey. Adrian couldn't understand it. Why was his father tolerating such treatment? What had broken his spirit so completely? Determined to find answers, Adrian decided it was time to dig deeper. That evening, he visited another old neighbor, Mr. Collins, who had always been close to his father. Adrian knocked on the door, and the elderly man greeted him warmly. "Adrian, it's good to see you, son. What brings you back?" Mr. Collins asked, his eyes lighting up. Adrian hesitated for a moment before replying, "I came to visit Dad. But something doesn't feel right. Can you tell me what's been going on?" Mr. Collins's smile faded. He gestured for Adrian to sit down and leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Your father is a good man, Adrian, but he's been struggling ever since your mother passed. When he married your stepmother, things started to change." Adrian listened intently as Mr. Collins continued. "She was sweet at first, but over time, she started controlling everything: his money, the house, even his friends. She isolated him, made him feel like he wasn't good enough. And your father, he's too kind. He never fights back. He just takes it all. Adrian's chest tightened as Mr. Collins's words sank in. Why didn't he tell me? He asked, his voice trembling with frustration. He didn't want to burden you, Mr. Collins said gently. He's always been proud of your success, Adrian. He didn't want you to worry about him. Adrian felt a mix of guilt and anger. His father had sacrificed his happiness to protect him, but it had cost him everything. Is it really that bad? Adrian asked, needing confirmation. Mr. Collins nodded solemnly. I've seen her humiliate him in front of people, force him to do all the work around the house. He's not the man he used to be, Adrian. He's just surviving. Adrian clenched his fists, a wave of determination washing over him. He couldn't let this continue. His father had given him everything, and now it was Adrian's turn to step up. That night, as Adrian sat in his hotel room, he devised a plan. He needed to expose his stepmother's behavior and restore his father's dignity. But he knew he had to be smart about it. If he acted rashly, he could make things worse. For the first time in years, Adrian felt a spark of purpose. This wasn't just about confronting his stepmother. It was about saving his father from a life he didn't deserve. Adrian sat by the window of his hotel room, staring out at the dark sky. His mind raced as he pieced together everything he had seen and heard over the past few days. The humiliation his father endured, the control his stepmother wielded, and the quiet pain his father carried. It was all too much to bear. Adrian knew he couldn't rush into this without a plan. If he wanted to truly free his father, he needed to act carefully and smartly. He opened his laptop and began researching ways to uncover the truth. He read stories of people in similar situations, searching for inspiration. An idea began to form in his mind. If he could gather proof of his stepmother's cruelty, there would be no way for her to deny it. The next morning, Adrian went to an electronics store and bought a small hidden camera. He planned to set it up in the house without anyone noticing. It was risky, but he needed solid evidence to confront his stepmother. Later that day, Adrian visited his father under the pretense of a surprise visit. His father was startled to see him at the door, his face a mix of happiness and nervousness. Adrian, what are you doing here? His father asked, his voice hesitant. I missed you, Dad. I couldn't stay away, Adrian said with a smile, masking the turmoil in his heart. His stepmother appeared in the hallway, her expression turning cold when she saw him. Adrian, how unexpected, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Adrian kept his composure and stepped inside, pretending not to notice her hostility. I just wanted to spend some time with Dad, he said casually. During the visit, Adrian carefully observed their interactions. He noticed the way his stepmother spoke to his father, cold, dismissive, and demanding. She barely acknowledged Adrian's presence, acting as though he were an inconvenience. While his father stepped outside to run an errand, Adrian quickly installed the hidden camera in the living room, where most of their conversations took place. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, knowing how much was at stake. He finished just in time before his father returned. Adrian spent the rest of the evening talking to his father, trying to make him smile. But behind the laughter, Adrian could see the exhaustion in his father's eyes. Dad, is everything okay? Adrian asked gently. His father hesitated, then forced a smile. Of course, son. Don't worry about me. But Adrian could see through the lie. His father's pride wouldn't let him admit the truth, and Adrian didn't press him. He knew the camera would capture what his father couldn't say. As Adrian left that night, he felt a mix of hope and dread. He knew the recordings would reveal the full extent of his stepmother's cruelty, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what he might see. Still, he made a silent vow. No matter what it takes, I'll get my father out of this. Adrian sat in his hotel room, staring at his laptop. The hidden camera he had installed in his father's house had been recording for 2 days now. His heart pounded as he plugged in the device to review the footage. He wasn't sure what he would see, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't be easy to watch. The first few minutes were uneventful, his father cleaning the living room, quietly moving about the house. But then, the door swung open, and his stepmother entered. Her voice was sharp and commanding. Why is this house still a mess? What do you even do all day? She snapped. Adrian clenched his fists as he watched his father flinch at her words. His father tried to respond, his voice calm but trembling. I've been cleaning all morning. I was about to... Excuses. Always excuses, she interrupted, slamming her hand on the table. Do you think this is a hotel where you can just lounge around? Get to work. The scene shifted to later in the day. His father was scrubbing the floor when his stepmother's friends arrived. Adrian watched in disbelief as she humiliated his father in front of them. This is my husband, she said with a mocking laugh. He's so useful around the house. Can't do much else, though. The women laughed, and Adrian's father lowered his head, saying nothing. Adrian felt a surge of anger. How could she treat him like this? The recordings revealed more of the same, his stepmother barking orders, belittling his father, and treating him like a servant. Every word, every action, was like a dagger to Adrian's heart. But the most heartbreaking moment came late one night. The house was quiet, and his father was sitting alone in the living room. He looked exhausted, his hands trembling as he held a small photo frame. Adrian leaned closer to the screen and realized it was a picture of his late mother. I'm sorry, his father whispered, his voice breaking. I've failed you. I've failed Adrian. I don't know how much longer I can do this. Adrian's eyes filled with tears. He had never seen his father so broken, so vulnerable. It was clear that his father had been enduring this torment for far too long, all in silence. Adrian closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The footage was more than enough proof to confront his stepmother and put an end to her cruelty. But he knew he couldn't just barge in without a plan. He needed to ensure that his father was safe and that his stepmother couldn't manipulate her way out of the situation. Adrian decided to contact a lawyer the next day to understand his options. He also planned to gather support from the neighbors who had witnessed the abuse firsthand. As Adrian prepared for the confrontation, one thought kept running through his mind. I've been away for too long. But now, I'm here, and I won't let anyone hurt him again. Adrian woke up early the next morning, his mind sharp and focused. The recordings he had watched had fueled a deep sense of urgency. His father couldn't continue living like this, not under the thumb of his cruel stepmother. Adrian had made his decision. Today, he was going to confront her and put an end to the torment once and for all. He dressed quickly, his hand steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of it was heavy. Confronting his father's wife, the woman who had systematically broken him down, wouldn't be easy. But he couldn't wait any longer. Adrian drove straight to his father's house, the familiar road now feeling foreign beneath his wheels. The house looked unchanged from the outside, but everything inside had shifted, his perspective, his purpose. When he parked the car, he noticed his father's car wasn't in the driveway. It was a small piece of relief, but he didn't let it slow him down. He walked up to the front door and knocked, his heart beating louder with each passing second. The door swung open, and there she was, his stepmother. She greeted him with a tight smile, the fake warmth in her voice obvious. Adrian, what a surprise. What brings you here? She asked, her eyes scanning him quickly. I'm here to talk to you, Adrian said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. Her expression changed, her smile faltering. Talk to me? About what? About how you've been treating my father, Adrian replied, his voice growing sharper. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered by his words. I don't know what you're implying. I think you do, Adrian said, his eyes narrowing. I've seen the footage. I've spoken to the neighbors. I know everything. Her face turned pale, the confident facade cracking for the first time. You're accusing me of what exactly? She asked, trying to regain control. Adrian took a deep breath. You've been humiliating him. You've been controlling him, using him as a servant. I have proof of everything, and I'm not leaving here until you hear me out. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Adrian could feel the weight of his words hanging between them. His stepmother's face twisted in anger, but there was also fear of being exposed for the truth that Adrian had uncovered. I don't know what you think you know, but you're wrong, she snapped, stepping closer to him. Your father is weak. He's always been weak. He's nothing without me. The word stung, but Adrian stood his ground. You've broken him. You've crushed his spirit. And I won't stand by while you destroy the man who raised me. His stepmother glared at him for a long moment, then crossed her arms. You have no idea what you're talking about. Your father isn't the man you think he is. I don't care about your version of him anymore, Adrian said, his voice cold. I care about the man I know, the man who worked hard for everything, the man who deserves respect, not this treatment. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with anger and resentment. But it was then that Adrian heard the sound of footsteps approaching. His father walked into the room, looking startled at the tension in the air. "Adrian, what's going on?" his father asked, his voice weak but filled with concern. Adrian turned to his father, his heart aching. "Dad, we need to talk. We need to get you out of this. You deserve better." His father looked between Adrian and his stepmother, the years of silent suffering evident in his tired eyes. For the first time, he seemed to crumble under the weight of it all. He sat down slowly, his hands shaking. "I don't know how to fight anymore, Adrian," he whispered, his voice breaking. Adrian rushed to his father's side, his anger melting into compassion. "You don't have to fight alone anymore. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere until you're free." Adrian turned back to his stepmother, his resolve clear. "This ends now. We're going to make sure my father's life changes for the better." His stepmother stood frozen, her power slipping away. Adrian knew the battle wasn't over yet, but the first step had been taken. His father was no longer alone, and together, they would rebuild the life that had been stolen from him.